Hello, CC of Middleburg Tutors. This is your tutorial for Science Week 15. We are back in our Janice Van Cleve 201 experiments, and for Week 15 we're going to be doing numbers 127 sinkers and 128 prints. So hopefully real quickly we'll just give you guys a rundown of how this is going to look in class. Okay, so make sure that you read, of course, everything in your book before you come to class. You guys have the sheets from Miss Wizzle that gives you a lot of really great background information so that you can have some extra talking points to go over with the kids. Feel free to do some extra research to really talk this up and expand this so that our science really does take up the full 30 minutes and make it as robust as possible. Alright, so number 127 is sinkers. The purpose of sinkers is to demonstrate how placer ore deposits form. And we're going to demonstrate this by having some water and soil and paper clips, shaking it up and seeing, how they all disperse so that the paper clips will most likely fall down first. The soil is going to take a little bit longer. And if you look through your book and read the why, it's going to kind of explain to you how all of that happens. But we're going to go over it real quick for you. So we have a pint-sized mason jar. This is smaller than what the book calls for, but that's what I had, so that's what we're going to use. We are supposed to add water, so it doesn't really matter exactly how much water you add. I would just say probably to fill it up close to about halfway. It's not exact, so that's totally fine. We are going to add some paper clips. I am doing 3 paper clips because we're using a smaller jar. The book calls for 5, but this should work just fine. So it tells us to go ahead and put our paper clips in, and then we're supposed to add some soil. I got potting soil, which I learned is probably not the best thing for this experiment, but that's what I've got now. So your book is going to tell you to add a whole cup of soil. Well, with potting soil, that does not work. So we're going to add a spoonful of potting soil, and this is the best way to make this experiment effective. That's all you're going to need for this. So we're going to add that in, put the lid on really good and tight so we don't spill. And then from this point, all we're supposed to do is shake it up. You can kind of pass it around and let the kids do this if you want to. That'll be fun. And then we let it sit. It says for about 5 minutes. Undisturbed so that we can see what happens, but you can already see, hopefully, on the video, is that our paper clips immediately went to the bottom. The soil is kind of circulating around in there. Most of it is still on the top. Some of it is sinking to the bottom, and eventually more of it will sink to the bottom as it sits undisturbed. So this is your entire experiment for sinkers. Again, you can talk through this. Why does this happen? How do we see this in everyday life? What happens when it rains to the earth that we have already? So lots of things that you can talk about with this, but a pretty simple demonstration for you. So that's number 127. All right, let's move on to 128, which is prints. This one's going to take you just a little bit longer because we are going to be mixing up some plaster in order to create a print. So for prints, our purpose is to determine how fossils were preserved, which is a really cool thing. We all know that there are lots of really neat fossils out there that have been found. It's probably a great thing that you could do to bring in some pictures of maybe some well-known fossils, or any fossils that you might possibly even have already at your house would be really cool. So we're going to demonstrate that by doing an imprint of a seashell and using plaster to fill it up, and then letting that dry, and we will see the fossil that was left behind. So for this one, we are supposed to have modeling clay, which I am using Play-Doh instead, which works just fine. We need a plate to work on. We need a seashell, which I have. This one is really, really big, and what you guys are going to get in class are actually much smaller, so that maybe you can do a couple of different ones if you want to, of different shaped shells, so I'll kind of leave that up to you guys. But I'm doing a big one just for the purposes of demonstrating here so you can see it a little bit better. This is actually the one that I made ahead of time in order to make sure that this all worked properly before I showed you guys, so hopefully you can kind of see the details a little bit of what the seashell may have looked like. This is my piece of plaster that was created from that. Okay, so you guys are all going to have a plate, a piece of Play-Doh. You are going to have some plaster of Paris in a bag for you. You are going to have a cup for mixing that in. You're going to need an extra cup for your water. You're going to need a spoon for mixing it. You need Vaseline to put on your seashell, which is what then gets pressed into the Play-Doh, and that helps it to not stick. And we're going to use a Q-tip in order to put the Vaseline all over the seashell. Alright, so our first thing is to lather up our seashell with some Vaseline. I would put a pretty decent amount on here, even though y'all's seashells are going to be really small, but that will help to ensure that it is not going to stick to our Play-Doh, because if it sticks too much, then we're not really going to get a very good imprint, and we're not going to be able to see all of the designs that the shell has, which is really cool. So this shell has a little bit of Vaseline left on it from when I did this earlier to practice it, so I don't have to put too much on here again. But you do want to make sure you get it in all the little crevices, because we're really going to be pressing on those to try to make sure that we get a good imprint. Alright, so let me move this out of the way. We have our ball, and our procedures tell us to place this down, put our Vaseline on our shell, and then we're going to press it into the Play-Doh. I'm going to go ahead and do just kind of the rim, because it's got a little double layer, which is really kind of cool, instead of doing the whole shell, and we will try to get an imprint of that one. So again, I'm just going to press it almost to where I'm like flattening out my Play-Doh as much as I can. It's going to leave a little indentation there for us to fill up. And then once I feel like I have that done pretty well, then I will very carefully try to peel away the Play-Doh from the shell. And now here is my Play-Doh with an imprint, which you may not be able to see on the camera, but that's okay. It works just fine, where we're going to now fill in with our plaster. So we're going to set that aside for just a second, and we're going to mix up our plaster. Alright, so I'm going to pour some water in a cup, because I do have to do exact measurements in order to get the consistency right on the plaster. So I just don't want to have to pour straight from this into my little spoon. Okay, so our book tells us to mix 4 spoons of plaster with 2 spoons of water. So it doesn't really matter if you're using a teaspoon or a tablespoon, as long as you're using the same size spoon for each. That way it has the right measurements. So 4 spoonfuls of plaster are going to go in our cup. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, you can set that aside. And then we're going to do 2 spoonfuls of water. So 1 and 2. And just stir it up. This is going to make our plaster. If for some reason you get in here and it feels like it's not the right consistency, because you should be able to not quite pour it out, but it should be liquid enough. Like this actually looks a little bit too thick for me. My spoon did not quite fill up with water each time, so I'm going to get a little bit more water to add to it, because it's really, really goopy in my cup right now. Alright, so that looks way better just by adding a tiny bit more water. Alright, I don't know if this is going to do any good for me to show you guys on the video, but this is what my plaster looks like inside. I can stir it around. It was really kind of goopy, almost like the Play-Doh, so I added a tiny bit more water, and now I have a really good, smooth consistency. So I'm going to take that and basically just fill in the whole indentation that I had from my seashell. And again, in class, if you guys are using smaller seashells, and doing a couple of different indentions, then I would encourage you to take your Play-Doh and maybe divide it into like 2 or 3 pieces. Make little balls out of those, and that way you can do indentions or impressions of several different seashells. But basically, it's almost like icing a cookie here. I am filling it in as much as I can with the plaster and going all the way up to the edges and spooning it around. And then once that's done, we're just going to let it sit. It says that it should take about 15 to 20 minutes for it to harden all the way. Mine actually took a little bit longer than that. I think it really almost took about 30 or 35 minutes. So you guys might just want to make sure for this science that you just give yourself enough time to be able to put it aside and then be able to come back and look at it later. So you might want to do this one first and then go do your sinkers and then come back to this one, or do this one first and go do your fine arts or whatever segment you're going to next, and then come back and spend a little bit more time looking over it once it has dried. But basically, once it has dried, you should be able to take it and very easily peel it away, and you will be left with your fossil of your seashell. So make sure again that you read through everything on here that's described for us in the book. Look at your notes from Miss Wizzle. That will give you a lot of background, and any other great resources that you find would be really helpful to expand on this. And that's it. Thanks so much.